So good afternoon. My name is Lonnie Douglas. I'm a board member with the Eugene Springfield Solidarity Network, and I'm here with Sarah Piscianeri, who is a board member with our sister organization, the Solidarity Action Network, our 501c4. And we're here today with Mayor Lucy Vinis for a candidate interview. I wanted to be clear with anybody who is watching this that these interviews are not endorsements of any candidate. We're leaving them open for anyone who is running to do. And what it is it's an opportunity for you to be able to hear what the candidate has to say. We'll ask a few questions and hopefully we'll help people to make a more informed decision when they are actually filling out their ballots. With the COVID crisis right now, our candidates are not able to go out and knock on doors. They're not able to engage as easily with people, so we hope that this will help. Mayor Vinis, we're going to go ahead and start off by giving you, 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes to say whatever you'd like to say, and then we'll roll into our questions.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity. We live in turbulent times. The issues we face are urgent and complex. Our public discussions are fraught with tension and anxiety about climate change, homelessness, the shortage of housing that people can afford, a national and local increase in expressions of hatred and bigotry, and now a pandemic. Why would anyone want to continue in the role of mayor in this landscape, you might ask? My answer is that as challenging as these issues are, we are making progress. We have a vision of our community as one that is committed to mitigating and adapting to climate change, that is determined to reduce the suffering of homelessness, that is committed to improving and increasing our supply of housing for everyone who calls Eugene home, and that over and over again has committed to fairness and justice. As always, the challenge is to translate our vision into reality through common strategies and specific tactics. In my first term, I focused on building those strategies, and now we're poised to make those improvements on the ground. I want to continue this work. On climate change, the Mayor's Ad Hoc Advisory Committee is midway through its review and assessment of the Climate Action Plan 2.0 to delineate the strategies and tactics that strengthen the accountability and progress in reaching our climate goals. All those tactics, electrification, transportation, and decarbonization, will require public investment, both in funds and commitment. I will continue to tie our choices about transportation and housing to our climate goals. We must be prepared to invest in change. We are essentially a suburban town that must set in motion our transition into an urban environment. That begins with transit, biking, and walking, and calls on us to respond thoughtfully, but with conviction, to ensure that more housing types are built in more parts of our community. We will stabilize more people who are unhoused in an array of shelter and housing options. I am committed to reducing suffering and engaging people who are unhoused in their own recovery. Our progress in the implementation of the TAC report recommendations enabled us to respond quickly and effectively to increase sanitation, outreach, and shelter services for the unhoused during this coronavirus crisis. I expect the emergency programs implemented in response to COVID-19 will provide valuable insights into our next steps. I will stand firm for fairness, both in my support for fair wages and workplaces and my commitment to bring communities of color, immigrants, and LGBTQ members of our community into public decision-making. Our economy is taking a deep hit as a result of the stay-home order to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Our priority is to get people back to work, to support our local businesses through the crisis and help them reopen. As we invest in recovery, we have the opportunity to build the community we need in the future, one that responds to climate and provides housing and opportunities to create a better, fairer city. The public is right to demand action on housing, homelessness, climate change, and justice. We have a lot of hard work to do. That doesn't and shouldn't overshadow the good work that happens every day. We are making progress. The accomplishments I've described are built on trust, goodwill, and communication. I promise to invest myself every day in bridging our divides with clarity, focus, and a healthy curiosity about what we might accomplish. Thank you for walking across that bridge with me.
Okay. Sarah, you want to take the first question?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Let's see here. So it is clear that the current recession will exacerbate Eugene's affordable housing crisis and force yet more residents onto the streets. How will you respond to the immediate spike in homelessness and housing instability as a result of this crisis? And what measures will you take over the long term to help Eugene's unhoused community?
So I have to begin by saying the city is devoting more resources to address homelessness than ever before, and we are clearly still not keeping up with the pace at which people are losing their housing. And that will only be more exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. The causes of this are bigger than Eugene, but it is now an issue that every city department in the city considers an integral part of its work, whether it's public works, the public library, or parks and open space. Staff teams are serving the unhoused. In 2019, the City Council and County Board adopted the 10 recommendations of the TAC report to improve our system of services for the homeless, including the creation of a low barrier permanent shelter. That commitment by city and county puts us in a stronger partnership than ever before to make strategic investments in addressing this issue. And our progress in the implementation of the TAC report enabled us really to respond quickly and effectively to increase the sanitation outreach and shelter options during this coronavirus crisis. I expect, as I said in my opening remarks, that the emergency programs implemented now will actually inform us as we move forward beyond the crisis in addressing homelessness. But you know, the reality is that we continue to struggle with inadequate capacity to provide safe legal places for people to sleep. We have inadequate program capacity for case management and inadequate transitional and permanent housing options. Finding locations and revenue to increase our capacity is the key challenge, and it will be made harder by the impact of COVID-19, but we have a strong foundation on which to build.
I have a quick follow-up question to that. You've mentioned a couple of times that the current response to COVID-19 within the unhoused community will help inform decision makers down the road on how to serve our unhoused neighbors. I'm wondering what sorts of insights you're gaining now that you see as something that will inform future decision making.
Well, thank you for the follow-up question. It's actually, I think, very interesting and hopeful. So, we know one of the recommendations of the TAC report was to have outreach teams meeting people where they are as a way of enabling them to sort of access services. And so we rolled that out. We were poised to do that already for the TAC implementation. We had the shutdown. We wanted people to be able to shelter in place. And so those outreach teams are now mobilized. And those outreach teams are now using an app in which they're tracking where they find people and meet people. And so we're able, for example, we've been hearing from Occupy Medical for years, we need hand washing stations, we need more sanitation for people who are unhoused. Well, one of the first things that happened was that because of that app and because of those outreach teams, they realized early on that where they hadn't put all the hand washing stations in places where people were actually congregating and needing them. And so those two pieces of information came together to relocate the hand washing stations so they'd be more effective. So I think we're understanding that, you know, we have some additional tools, we're playing out those tools, and those tools may really influence how we do that outreach and that work in the future.
I have one follow-up for that question, because you talked about, you said, and it was just a little bit in there, but when you talked about safe legal places for people to sleep, I think this is one that we hear a lot in our community about. Obviously, everybody needs a safe place, but when we talk about a legal place, um, if people do not have a place to sleep, what do we consider legal? I mean, if there's nowhere for them to sleep and they sleep um, in on the street, um, how do we make it illegal if there's nowhere for them to sleep? So that would
Yeah.
be the question.
No, it's absolutely the right question, because it's the crux of the issue. Is we do want to identify areas where people people who have no other shelter, where they can sleep without being in any way in violation of any city rules. So our challenge always is that we are calling upon our police, right, to sort of manage what's happening in our public landscape with respect to where people are housed. Well, we don't want that. Nobody wants that. Police don't want to do that. It's not good for the unhoused. We don't want that. What we want is to be able to identify, just as we have done with the rest stops, right? We want to be able to identify places where people can set up a tent or live in a tent that the city has provided, and they're there. And so we've kind of wrapped our arms around it, and we're not in this constant state of tension about whether you have a right to be there or not. We've sanctioned it. That's what we're looking for. And it's not a simple thing, because the numbers of unhoused are so high, and finding locations is deeply challenging. But that really is the work. Until we have enough shelter systems and enough programs, and we need every possible stopgap measure.
Okay. All right. We'll move on to the second one here. So the payroll tax. Last June, the city council voted to implement a payroll tax in the city of Eugene for safety services and such. And we understand the need for those services. Can you explain, this is a two-part question, can you explain why the payroll tax, which payroll taxes are generally regressive form of taxation that impacts low wage earners far more than wealthy earners, why a payroll tax? And then the other part of the question is, it was a very controversial tax. Mike Clark and Betty Taylor, neither of whom are running for right now, they moved to refer the tax to the voters. The rest of the city council voted to not allow us to vote on it. Can you explain why you support not referring that tax to the voters?
Yep, absolutely. So the background is, of course, that the council based their decision on the payroll tax on the work of a group of 3 counselors and 5 community members who were identified as that community safety revenue team. And so they spent about 4 months reviewing the full array, all imaginable ways in which funds could be raised. We had, prior to that already, the city had done a lot of work even before Chief Skinner came on board. We had David James as a sort of interim director of the police, and he had done a lot of statistical work assessing where the strengths and weaknesses were in terms of staffing, what did we need. And so we had an internal city team that had worked on what services needed to be improved and where we were short. And keeping in mind, for example, that our police have received the number of calls for service increased by 21% from our 2014-2017 numbers. That's a huge leap in 5 years. But we haven't added any staffing, and that the police are not responding to 1/3 of the police calls. So the issue was profound. Council designated that committee to do the research. They looked at the full range of options, and we had a number attached to it. The internal committee had looked at that number. They had a number that was $23 million. That's a big number to come up with. And so the recommendation from that committee was, having looked at everything, the only revenue stream that would be sustainable and robust enough to really meet that need would be a payroll tax. And the concept behind the tax is that it's broad and shallow. So the more people who pay into a tax, the less any individual has to pay. And in this case, minimum wage workers are exempt, and workers who earn between $12 and $15 an hour pay a lower rate than other workers. So in general, across the board, the tax is less than an hour's wages a month. So it's not a deep tax, it's very broad. So that was the idea. There's a huge need, and we know that the people who live in poor neighborhoods, people who are struggling with poverty, are more profoundly, disproportionately impacted by crime than other neighborhoods. So there's a balancing act there. The council decided to simply vote to simply create an ordinance and support that ordinance rather than taking out to the voters. I'll say two things about that, which is the council is responsible for balancing the budget. That they have to come up with revenue and they have to support the expenses, and they do that every year. That does not go to a public vote. It's part of their job. It's their mandate to be able to balance that budget. And so they've made a commitment for several years that public safety was a significant need in that community, and they were going to create a revenue stream. So I think at the end of the day, it's their job to balance that budget. It's their job to make sure that we have the city's services that we need. And they had done their homework. And I think there was no particular evidence that there was a better strategy that we could implement effectively in that time frame. And so that's why I supported it. I thought the homework has been done.
Okay. Just to follow up to that, I mean, I got lots of follow-up questions I'd love to ask, but we do not have time for that. So, but the follow-up that I am curious about, you're talking about the increase in the number of calls that the police get. I think 21% of calls, but no increase in staffing. We know that the police, that our law enforcement has seen a huge increase in the number of nuisance calls that they get. In other words, people who are, outside of a business, sleeping on the sidewalk, whatever. Those nuisance calls are taking up a huge amount of their time. In the payroll tax, in the very beginning of it, it talks about how much money goes to each of the different 5 areas. But in the actual language of the tax, it does not specify. Wouldn't it be better to take and give something like Cahoots more money and have them respond to nuisance calls than having our police do it? Because that's a huge part of what is taking this up. Before I went in the Coast Guard, I worked on a community service patrol in Anchorage, and that ambulance patrolled like Cahoots does, and it responded to those nuisance calls. And the law enforcement didn't have to. And those people were EMTs and trained professionals that were able to to de-escalate situations and things like that. And they would only call the law enforcement if things escalated or there was a real serious need. How do you feel about that?
So I have a couple of responses to that. The first is that absolutely we want to be targeting the right resource to the level of the problem, that we don't want to use our most high-powered police officers to address something that is essentially a nuisance crime. So you're absolutely right. The assessment that the city went through and that the police chief works from now is how do we use the right personnel for the right issue. So that's true. I think that if you actually look at the stats, and I don't have all of the police stats in front of me right now, but if you actually look at the stats, we have a very large increase in violent crime and in crime that's related to mental health. So the police are dealing with more dangerous situations much more often than they used to. So this is not just a question of, a trespass violation by someone who's homeless. This is a question of people who are armed, who are doing drug deals, who are really dangerous. And that has increased in our community. The other piece I would say about my third point about the way the ordinance is written and the way the payroll tax works is that it is divided up. So the intention there is, it is designed in order to increase our investment in community court, increase some services for people who are homeless, and to do some prevention for teens, who are unstable. So it is designed to target and to channel funds in those directions. It is written very specifically, so the staff did put together a very specific proposal about how many officers would be hired, what was needed in the community court, what was needed in the municipal court, and the voters did get a chance to vote on the ballot measure in November that really ties that that payroll tax to those specific numbers. So the tax cannot be increased without going to a public vote, and those funds cannot be used for a different purpose without going to a public vote. And there is a review committee every year, so the public will have an opportunity to say, did the police do what they say they were going to? Did we get a new room, municipal court opened up? Did we get homeless services attached to this? Did we? So you as members of the public will get a chance to review that. That's going to be transparent information. And we have committed ourselves that this is the only way those funds are going to be spent.
Thanks for that, Mayor. I do have another follow-up question related to the topic of committees and who counts as the public. So I'm wondering how the committee recruitment process is done, and if there's any special attention spent on folks who fall within those lower income brackets who are more, although the tax is shallower for them, you know, every dollar counts when $12 to $15 still isn't enough to cover the cost of living in our city. So I'm wondering, is there a process where you're specifically looking to reach out to those communities that are most burdened by taxes like this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There are two levels. So the short answer is yes, and we now pretty much incorporate in a lot of work we do, not just with the payroll tax, but an equity perspective. And we have both a city department, the Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement Department, that really looks at those equity pieces, but we also have a Human Rights Commission. So we really are looking at that and looking at how we reach out more deeply. And then within any committee, usually it is a staff job. The council will say to the city manager, we approve this committee, and it is really up to the manager and her staff to identify who's there. I think to be honest, it has always been a struggle for us because of the time commitment of committees, because people who are struggling to make ends meet do not have often a lot of time to meet committees. They might have childcare, they might have two jobs. It's very hard. I actually will say that I think one of the positive lessons around this COVID and are doing so many things through, Zoom meetings and others, is that we might actually be able to open the doors in a way for some people who haven't been able to participate in those committees because they can't leave their house because they have school-age children or the timing doesn't work, that we might actually be able to kind of provide more access to people who often don't get involved in those conversations. So I'm completely agree. I think it's a huge frustration for all of us that we much too often kind of hear from the same segment of the community on any particular item, and the goal always is to reach a little deeper and broader. So yeah, it's the work ahead of us. How do we do that? How do we do that fairly and successfully?
You want to take the next question there, Sarah?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for looking into that, Mayor. That's a really important task and a difficult one. Okay, so for the next question, Eugene has one of the worst affordable housing shortages in the country. What approach should the city take to resolving our housing crisis?
This is one of these big challenges, and of course, as you know, I came into this role as mayor having worked at shelter care for 7 years, and was deeply and painfully aware of the cost of housing and the shortage of housing, how vulnerable so many people are in our community, that if you can't afford the housing, everything else falls apart. I also think in this climate, we're seeing where housing is very expensive, that it's deeply challenging for renters. And I'm quite worried right now, actually, about, even though we have a moratorium on evictions, worried about people who are English is not their native language and they may not be understanding what their rights are. Quite concerned, particularly about our Latinx community, losing their housing and not realizing that that they have rights. So all that said, the first steps that it took in my first term, we began with the Housing Tools and Strategies series of workshops with about 36 participants representing a broad array of developers and neighborhood advocates and renters. They came up with a list of 80 possible ways in which the city could have a positive impact on the affordability and availability of housing. And so the city council and the staff have used that list of 80 as sort of the framework of our marching orders. And so a number of those things were already on our list of things that we needed to do. But one of the first ones was construction excise tax, which had been proposed to us by the Housing Policy Board. And so the council passed a construction excise tax this past year, and we have been collecting that money. The city government made a commitment to putting $500,000 into that affordable housing trust fund every year. So this year it has about $750,000 in that affordable housing trust fund. It's the first time we've ever actually created a local revenue stream that would enable us both the flexibility to support our local builders in building housing that is at the lower end of the market. The problem here is that it costs as much to build housing that rents for a high price as housing that rents for a low price. I mean, certain basic construction costs are simply fixed. The labor costs are fixed. The material costs are fixed. You can obviously use some more expensive and less expensive materials, but essentially it's expensive to build housing. So construction excise tax gives us this little extra money where we can help with land banking. We can help cover some of those costs. So I think that's a big part. That's a big piece of it. And then we're working on a series of other strategies within that larger list.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up, Sarah?
I do have one follow-up. Yeah. Do you think that the 0.33% construction excise tax has at all deterred development? And do you think a higher tax, something more like Corvallis's 3% tax, would have deterred development, or would in the future?
Well, so as the council actually, we spent a year landing on that final ordinance for the construction excise tax. And there are communities that have a 1% tax. There were councilors that definitely wanted us to have a 1% tax. When we started the conversation, the builders and the Chamber of Commerce said to us, we're already struggling. Our margins are so narrow. Let us be part of the solution and not just be in opposition to this. And so we took the time, and Better Housing Together really did that heavy lifting of bringing the community together to really focus on the construction excise tax. So the final ordinance is a compromise. The first year it's at 0.33, the second year it goes up to 0.5, and then it stays at 0.5. And so yes, we might have raised more money if we'd gone up to 1%. The calculation was the one you've questioned, is would that have deterred the building of housing? And all I can say is that we turn to builders and they're looking at the margins, and they're looking at what they can get loans. They're going to financial institutions to get loans, and they have to make it work. So that was a compromise. I'm not an expert in the field, so, and there's no there's no sort of default setting. What we know is that we're not building enough of that housing. And we also know from the research we've done, from the Housing Tools and Strategies, from the outreach on the construction excise tax, that if we have funds to defray some of the costs, then it will enable a builder to keep the rents lower or the sale price lower. So that's the strategy. we'll evaluate it. Every 3 years we're going to evaluate this, so we have a chance to recalibrate.
One thing I just wanted to say, I misspoke when I said 3% in Corvallis. It's 1.5% is Corvallis.
Yeah, a little higher. Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure that was wasn't spreading false information. One quick, very, very quick question on to that. When it's reevaluated, is at that moment, is there potential for the percentage to change?
Yeah, council could always it's council writes an ordinance, they can always amend an ordinance. So if they get information that indicates that should be shifted one way or the other, then they have the freedom to do that.
Thank you.
So moving on to our next one, and this is the one we switched the order of for you. We also cleaned it up a little bit because it was really long when we wrote it before. So the need to incentivize affordable housing development can place landowners, developers, they're lumped in together, affordable housing or low-income housing activists, and labor groups all at odds. How would you manage the conflict between the 1% and the rest of the community? And when we talk 1%, we're really talking about the landowners and developers. We're labeling the low-income housing activists and the labor groups and the other working class folk community. So those groups, how would you, what's your plan to sort of manage those conflicts a little bit and still get us the housing that we need?
Well, I think we're on that path, and I think that the process that we went through on the construction excise tax was a process of bringing those groups together who often disagree and feel that they're in conflict with one another. And that was the work, was to try and build a bridge so that we're all in this together. We all want to build housing. Developers want to build housing. Housing activists want to build housing. The city wants to see the housing built. We all want to build housing. Realtors want to see housing built. We all want to do that. So I think it's starting from that place. Like, this is the goal that we're all aiming for. How do we get to that place? I will say the city, we're in an economic crisis. We will be in a recovery mode from this economic crisis for some time. And so city investments that enable construction to happen are good investments. Those are fair wage jobs. That's economic development. That's creating what we need. And we have the opportunity on our riverfront development, for instance, where if and when that's fully built out, it would be 500 units of housing, and 75 of those units will be affordable housing. So we can make those investments, and we attach, as a city government, we attach fair wage laws to that, and we can continue to attach public benefits to any of that work that the city itself is promoting. And I will just say, as a closing piece, that I grew up in a union family. I come out of this environment of supporting good wage workers, supporting collective bargaining, supporting the importance of how we support our workers. I have stood up for AFSCME in their strike in 2018. I stood up for the GTFF and the SAIU when they were in negotiations with the university. This is a long-held commitment of mine, that people should work in safe and fair workplaces and have fair wages. So that is a piece that I will always carry into these conversations.
Outstanding. So I have one follow-up. So it's something that sort of sticks in my craw a little bit, but we always talk about affordable housing, and affordable housing for a wealthy person is not the same as affordable housing for a poor person. I'm wondering if you would be willing to commit to, instead of using the term affordable housing, talking about using the term low income housing, because I think that's really what we need. We need to be very clear that's what we need is income for common working class folk who are making well below the median income, yet they're working 40, 60, 80 hours a week. And those are the people we need to ensure that have that housing. Would you be willing to commit to using the term low income more than affordable?
So yes, I recognize the challenge. I just want to say for you and for anybody, people who are watching this, that affordable, the term affordable is a specific term, right? It's a legal term. It's attached to housing and urban development funds. So when we actually say affordable, we are meaning a very specific thing, which is money that is coming with those housing that is coming with those federal subsidies. So that is why I say affordable, because that's actually what that is referring to. But you're absolutely right. It's why I said, even said in my opening remarks, more housing that people can afford, right?
Yeah.
Which is really what we're after. And what we know is that we need the whole range of housing, and particularly at the lower end.
Okay. Sarah, you want to ask the final?
Yeah, and we will jump to the final question here. Sorry. What is your vision for the city? And as an elected representative, what role will you play in bringing that vision to reality? Sorry for the back.
Actually, and that is one of the things that I enjoy about these Zoom meetings, is that there's always a little, domestic something going on, whether it's the dog barking or the child asking for something. I opened this talking about those issues that are of such critical importance to me: housing, homelessness, climate change, equitable economic development, and social justice. And my vision of a community is that we address those issues, right? That we take care of those issues. I mean, I say it in the broadest sense, which is we want to be a community in which everyone is able to thrive. But I think that the fundamental piece is, how do we make an investment in this community, which is based on fairness? We actually have a structure. It's a national structure. We have it locally, that is built on inequity. It is built on some people having better advantages than others. When we talk about housing, I made this comment, and I say this often, which is housing is infrastructure, but we never talk about it as infrastructure. But if we did talk about it as infrastructure, people would have housing, just the way people have electricity, right? We would invest in it because it's essential. And my vision now, we're facing this, the human toll of this COVID, that is a health toll and an economic toll. And we will face it into the future. But we have an opportunity now, because of this crisis, that we are going to be making investments in our economy, in the way we recover. We are looking to the state and we are looking to the federal government to make those investments. And many of those will be infrastructure investments. So we do have an opportunity in which we can say, let's not rebuild the society we have had. Let's build the society we want and we need in the future. And that's a society in which we are building housing. We're investing in housing. We are investing in services for the homelessness. We are creating an infrastructure that adapts and mitigates our impact on climate change, right? We can invest in electrification. We can invest in that charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. We can invest in our transportation. So I think, my vision is that we look at, let's be true to our values. We say these things are important. We say we want to act on climate change. Let's act on climate change, and let's act on climate change in a way that creates a better community for everyone.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mayor Vinis, for participating in this. We appreciate it. Again, I just want to let anybody watching know that these interviews are not an endorsement of any particular candidate. So Solidarity Action Network and Eugene Springfield Solidarity Network are nonpartisan, and we don't actually endorse candidates anyway, but it is a way for people to get to know you better, hear what you have to say, and hopefully will help them make a more informed decision when they're voting. So thank you so much. Did you want to say anything, Sarah?
Sorry.
No?
Sorry, I was jumping in ahead of you, sir.
You're totally fine. No, I have nothing else to say except thanks for your responses, Mayor, and I appreciate.
And you've got a website or anything, Mayor?
What's that?
You got a website or anything you want to plug too?
I do. LucyVinis.com and a Facebook Re-elect Mayor Lucy Vinis. Thank you very much. I am really, I just want to close by expressing my appreciation to you for doing it. This is a huge commitment to the community to conduct these interviews and give all the candidates a chance to be faces and voices and get our ideas out there. So I'm grateful to you. It makes our community strong that you're doing what you're doing. So thank you very much for this forum.
Cool.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. You have a nice day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.